Welcome to Module 6, Part 1, Overview of Phonological Development and Phonological Processes. In this module, we will explore the phonological processes used by children acquiring their first language, including both children with typically developing language skills and children with phonological disorders. In Part 1, I will overview phonological development and introduce the three main categories of processes observed in children with and without phonological disorders. As any of you who have spent time around toddlers probably know, children do not learn their first language perfectly or all at once. Instead, they acquire the sounds, words, and syntax of their first language a little at a time. In most cases, they progress more or less continuously toward adult norms. Sometimes it seems by leaps and bounds. This process continues through most of the first decade of life, and when children do produce new speech sounds, they don't necessarily produce them consistently or in every context. Therefore, we need some vocabulary to talk about children's patterns of phonological acquisition. The first term is customary production, which means that a child produces a speech sound correctly at least 50% of the time, in at least 2 or more contexts. This could mean, for example, that a child produces a s sound correctly about 60% of the time in initial and final single consonant contexts, but never in consonant clusters. The term mastery, on the other hand, as the name suggests, means that the child really has the sound down and can produce it correctly more than 90% of the time in all contexts. So in the case of the s sound again, in order to be considered as having mastered the s sound, the child would have to produce it correctly nearly all the time in every possible context. For example, in initial and final position in both single consonant contexts and in consonant clusters, etc. Unlike what it may sometimes seem, children's patterns of production and misproduction of speech sounds are not random. Instead, they tend to be systematic in that we can find patterns in their speech and in the differences between their productions and that of an adult or an older child. Because the phonological patterns of children's speech are systematic, we can classify them into different categories. As we will see, most of these processes can be seen as simplifying syllables or sound sequences, or substituting earlier acquired sounds for later acquired ones. Also, because the acquisition of speech sounds tends to follow a certain sequence, we can predict patterns of phonological processes and compile normative data so that children's speech patterns may be compared to those of typically developing children of the same age, their phonological peers. Finally, many of these processes may apply intermittently, so that a child may produce several variants of the same sound in different contexts, or even several different variants of the same word. So it's important for speech-language pathologists to offer several opportunities for a child to produce a target sound in a variety of contexts. Children with phonological disorders display both similarities to and differences from their peers with typically developing phonologies. On the one hand, children with phonological disorders often produce many of the same phonological processes as children with typically developing phonologies. In these cases, children with phonological disorders may maintain a particular phonological process well past the age at which this process is normally resolved in children with typically developing phonologies. Thus, the speech of children with phonological disorders may resemble that of younger children. One example might be the observation of the process of gliding in a child of 9 or 10. in which the child would produce a target word such as red as wed. This process is common in younger children, but is typically resolved somewhat earlier than age 9 or 10. On the other hand, children with phonological disorders may exhibit some phonological processes that are rarely observed in children with typically developing phonologies. An example might be initial consonant deletion. For example, if a child says the word cake as ache. This process is uncommon in the speech of children with typically developing phonologies, even at younger ages. It's also important to distinguish between differences in pronunciation that are due to phonological disorders and differences that are due to other disorders that may also affect speech and phonological development. Typically, speech-language pathologists classify a phonological disorder as one where the child is not learning the rules of organization of speech sounds and their patterning in a language in the same way or at the same rate as typically developing peers, even though the child has access to or can hear all of the information. In other words, in a phonological disorder, we believe that the problem is a cognitive one. The child isn't organizing his or her phonology, or mental representation of the phonemic contrasts and rules of the sound system of the language, in the same way as his or her typically developing peers. On the other hand, physiological differences in the speech mechanism, that is, in the articulators and the vocal tract, can have aerodynamic or articulatory consequences that might make the production of certain sounds impossible for a child. For example, a child with a cleft palate may be unable to prevent airflow over the velum and into the nasal cavity, even when the velum is raised. This will make the appropriate production of stop, fricative, and affricate consonants impossible for that child. Finally, the presence of a hearing loss limits the amount or type of acoustic input that is available to a child. For a child with a hearing loss, some speech sound differences may be inaudible, leading the child to classify them as the same sound. So, phonological development may differ in children with hearing loss compared to their normal hearing peers, but for different reasons than for children with phonological disorders. The child with a hearing loss may have no cognitive difference from typically developing peers in terms of ability to organize his or her phonology appropriately, but may organize it differently due to a lack of sufficient or appropriate information or input. It is beyond the scope of this course to lay out the ways that speech-language pathologists can differentiate between these different situations, but it is important to emphasize that it is crucial that you be aware of these differences and the need to distinguish between them. The type of treatment that is planned or selected might be quite different depending on the underlying reason for the difference. Now we will briefly overview the typical order of acquisition of phonemes, which occurs from about 2 to 3 years of age to about 9 years of age. Typically, the non-diphthong vowels are acquired relatively early. For the consonants, acquisition typically progresses from the most to the least visible, or from a more front place of articulation to more back places of articulation, and from less complex articulation to more complex articulation. If you think of the order of acquisition in this way, from more visible to less visible, and from less complex to more complex articulation, the order of acquisition of phonemes should make more sense and be easier to memorize. First, in terms of place of articulation, as I said, more visible sounds are acquired first, so the consonants with bilabial and alveolar places of articulation, for example, b as in big and d as in dog, are acquired earlier than consonants with palatal and velar places of articulation. For example, k as in cat or r as in red. Just think how much easier it is for a child to accurately imitate what he or she sees for the b sound as in big than for the k sound as in cat. Next, in terms of manner of articulation, sounds that are more simple to articulate are acquired prior to sounds that are more complex to articulate. So the stop and nasal manners of articulation, like b as in big and the nasal m as in mama, are acquired before the glide, fricative, liquid, and affricate manners of articulation, such as r as in red, the liquid, or the fricative s as in Sue. Let's think about ease of articulation. For the stops and nasals, all you really have to do is mash one articulator against the place of articulation, either with the velum up or the velum down. It doesn't really take much finesse. On the other hand, for the s sound like in Sue, a fricative consonant, you have to place your tongue blade against the alveolar ridge and then make a small groove in the tongue so that air can flow through, making sure that the groove is small enough so that the airflow is turbulent. And all of that the child has to figure out without really being able to see what's going on in there when other people make that sound. So another way of thinking about the order of acquisition of the manner categories is that phonological acquisition progresses from the extremes of closure in the oral cavity, from complete closure in the oral cavity for the stop and nasal consonant manners of articulation, with decreasing amount of closure for the affricate, fricative, liquid, and glide manners of articulation. In the next section, I will review one by one phonological processes that are commonly observed in typically developing children and in children with phonological disorders. Each of these processes can be categorized into a broader category of phonological processes. It's extremely useful to categorize individual processes in this way because it can help us to see consistent patterns in a child's speech, rather than just collecting a list of apparently unrelated misarticulations. The three categories of phonological processes that are observed in children with typically developing phonologies and in children with phonological disorders are the syllable structure processes, which usually change the number of phonemes in a syllable, the substitution processes, in which one sound is replaced by another, usually an earlier acquired sound, and the assimilatory processes, in which one sound becomes more like a nearby sound. Finally, the idiosyncratic processes are observed mainly in children with phonological disorders. As we go along, note in some cases, a phonological process may seem to fit into two different categories. In the real world of the speech-language pathologist, one would need to assess the whole pattern or set of processes to decide which category best fits with the overall pattern. In our case, since we are mostly looking at only one process at a time, there might be more than one possible right answer in some cases. This is the end of Part 1.